They found the letter behind a loose stone in the pantry wall, folded into quarters, and gone the colour of weak tea, and it was Mrs. Bent's. Harrow, who brought it to her, not because she meant to pry, but because the stone had been loose for a decade and had finally given way beneath a heavy pot. Eleanor did not open it at once. She set it on the scrubbed table beside the flour bin, and looked at it the way she looked at most things that arrived without warning, which was to say plainly and without hurry, as though the letter itself might be persuaded to wait until she was ready for it. When she did open it, her hands did not shake, though the words inside were the kind that might have made another woman's hands shake considerably. It was a notice of dismissal, 11 years old, signed by a duke long since dead, ending the employment of one Josiah Ashworth, land steward, for reasons the letter described as conduct unbecoming, and did not trouble to elaborate upon further. There was no mention of what that conduct had been. There never had been, not in 11 years, not in any account she had heard repeated in the village, in the kitchens, in the low murmuring that follows a family down long after the family itself has stopped listening. She read it twice, folded it back along its old creases, and put it in the tin box beneath her bed where she kept the other papers that belonged to her father. Then she went back to her work, because there was flour to sift and a fire to bank, and a day that did not pause for old grievances, however freshly they surfaced. This was, if anyone had troubled to ask her, the whole of her method. She did not weep over what could not be undone in an afternoon. She set it aside in its proper place and returned to whatever labour stood before her, on the understanding that grief and work could occupy the same house without one extinguishing the other. The other servants at Rendell Hall found this quality of hers difficult to name. Mrs. Harrow called it steadiness. The younger maids less charitably called it coldness, though none of them had seen her alone at night with the tin box open on her knees, reading a dismissal notice by candlelight, as though the right angle of study might yet reveal the truth folded inside it. She was 26 that autumn, unmarried, employed as under-housekeeper to a household that had, until recently, shown no particular interest in her beyond the competence of her hands, and she had been at Rendell for 2 years without once setting eyes on the new Duke, who was said to spend the better part of his time in London, and the better part of his correspondence complaining about the state of his own drains. This was not surprising to her. Dukes, in her experience, tended not to look closely at anything below the level of their own boots, and the estate reflected it, the western wall gone soft with damp, the old walled garden choked to brambles, the fen at the eastern boundary silting up year on year until the tenant farms nearest it flooded with a regularity the tenants had come to expect the way one expects weather. Nobody had drained that fen properly since her father managed the land, and nobody, so far as Eleanor could determine, had thought to ask why the knowledge of how to do it had simply vanished from the estate the same season he had. But this is the history of a family before it is the history of a house, and so we must go back, past the letter behind the pantry stone, past the 2 quiet years of scrubbing and sifting and banking fires, back to a summer 11 years distant when Josiah Ashworth was still a man with a full head of grey hair, for, being able to read the intentions of water the way other men read Scripture, it is there that the injustice begins, and it is there we must look if we are to understand why a woman with soil under her fingernails would one day stand in the great hall of Rendell and refuse to lower her eyes before a duke who had not yet given her leave to speak. Josiah Ashworth had come to Rendell as a young man with nothing but an apprenticeship in drainage engineering and a stubborn conviction that land, properly understood, would forgive almost any insult if it was given back its natural course. He rose, over 20 years, from under-steward to the position of land steward proper, and in that time he had turned the eastern fen from a graveyard of drowned crops into the most productive ground on the estate, had rebuilt the walled garden stone by stone. Every observation he had ever made about soil, water, season, and yield, in a hand so precise that the old Duke, the father of the man who now held the title, had once called it the most honest handwriting he had ever seen on an estate document. Honesty, it would transpire, was not a quality that his state rewarded consistently. The trouble began, as trouble of that kind so often does, with a discrepancy in the accounts that had nothing to do with Josiah Ashworth and everything to do with the old Duke's younger brother, a man named Reginald, who managed the family's London interests and had, for the better part of 3 years, by quietly diverting rents from 2 of the estate's most profitable farms into investments of his own devising, investments that had, by the time Josiah discovered them, already begun to fail. Josiah brought the ledgers to the old Duke directly, as he believed a steward was obligated to do, laying out in his precise hand the exact sums, dates, and discrepancies, expecting, because he was, in his own quiet way, a man of some innocence about the workings of power, that the truth of the matter would settle itself once it was seen clearly. It did not settle itself. It settled instead upon Josiah Ashworth, who was dismissed within the month for conduct unbecoming, his name quietly attached to whispers of embezzlement that were never substantiated, because they were never meant to be, only suggested. Only left to hang in the air of every drawing-room in the county, long enough to ruin a man without anyone having to prove a single word of it. Reginald continued in his post. The ledgers, Josiah's own careful records, were confiscated as estate property and never returned. And Josiah Ashworth, who had given 20 years and both his hands to the land at Rendell, left the estate with his wife and his daughter and a reputation he would spend the rest of his life failing to repair, though he never stopped trying quietly, in letters that went unanswered and appeals that went unheard, until the effort of it, more than any illness, seemed to Eleanor to have worn him down to nothing at all. She was 15 when they left Rendell, and she remembered the leaving more clearly than she remembered almost anything from before it. Her mother's face set hard against tears in front of the neighbours, her father's hands, those same steady hands that had coaxed a fen into obedience, shaking only once when he folded his tools into a chest and locked it, as, though locking away the tools, might also lock away the 20 years they represented. He did not speak of Rendell again except in the evenings when he thought she was asleep, when he would take out his old notebooks, the ones he had kept privately, duplicates of the ledgers he'd surrendered, written for no one but himself, and go over the old figures again, murmuring to the fire as if the fire might finally agree with him that he had been right. He died when she was 20 of nothing anyone could properly name, though Eleanor had her own private theory about what a man dies of when he is made to carry an unproven accusation for the whole of his remaining life. Her mother followed 2 years later, and Eleanor, lone, with nothing left to her but a locked chest of tools she did not yet know how to use, and a set of notebooks written in a hand she had spent her childhood learning to read upside down across the supper table, did the only thing that seemed to her both practical and, in some manner, Harrow, or anyone else, like an act of faith. She took a position in service, because a woman alone must eat, and she chose Rendell, because if her father's knowledge was to mean anything at all, it would have to mean something here, on the very ground it had been drawn from, however long it took, however few people ever knew her name while she did it. She did not go to Rendell to accuse anyone. She was not, whatever the servants' hall might later suspect of her, a woman nursing a plot. She went because the fen was still flooding, because the walled garden was still choked with bramble, because somewhere in a locked chest under her bed she had inherited the exact knowledge required to fix both, and because doing the work quietly, competently, without asking anyone's permission to be right, seemed to her a far surer form of justice than any confrontation could provide. Her father had brought the truth to a duke once, directly, honestly, and it had cost him everything. She did not intend to make the same mistake. She intended instead to let the land speak for her, the way it had always spoken most honestly for her father, and to let whoever was paying attention draw their own slow conclusions. It began in that first autumn after the letter surfaced from behind the pantry stone, with a corner of the kitchen garden that no one else wanted to trouble with, a strip of ground gone to weed and standing water behind the old glass house, considered by the rest of the staff not worth the labour. Eleanor asked Mrs. Harrow's permission to work it in the hours after her regular duties were done, and Mrs. Harrow, who had never seen the girl idle a single evening in 2 years, saw no reason to refuse her, though she did remark, not unkindly, that Eleanor would ruin her hands digging in cold mud for a patch of ground that grew nothing but nettles. Eleanor said only that the ground was not the problem, the water beneath it was. She had read that much in her father's notebooks before she ever set a spade to soil, had traced with her finger the old diagrams he had drawn of Rendell's original drainage channels, laid down 100 years before either of them was born, and long since forgotten by everyone who might have maintained them. The strip behind the glass house sat directly above one such channel, silted shut, and it took her the better part of a fortnight, working by lantern light after supper, to clear it enough that the standing water finally had somewhere to go. By the second week of October, the ground had begun to drain properly for the first time in a generation, and by the third week she had turned the first of the soil, working it with her father's own spade, the one she had taken from the locked chest and cleaned and sharpened herself, because it seemed to her wrong to do this particular work with any other tool. She told no one what she was doing beyond the fact of it. She did not mention her father's name, or his ledgers, or the notebooks under her bed. She simply worked on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and every Sunday afternoon, the weather allowed, and let the ground answer for itself. Mr. Dye Pell, the estate's steward, a cautious, watchful man who had served under the previous land agent and distrusted enthusiasm on principle, noticed the cleared strip before anyone else did, because it was Mr. Nair Pell's habit to walk the grounds each morning with the particular suspicion of a man who believed most improvements to be accidents waiting to become expenses. He found Eleanor there one grey morning in late October, on her knees in the turned soil, and stood over her for a long moment before he spoke. "This ground has been dead 8 years," he said. "I should like to know what you imagine will grow in it now." "Cabbages, to begin," Eleanor said, not looking up. "Once the salt's worked out of it, after that, whatever the kitchen wants. And the water has somewhere to go now. It didn't before." Mr. Bro. Pell said nothing further that morning, but he returned 3 days later and again the following week, and each time he found the same steady progress, the same unhurried competence, and each time he asked a question that was answered plainly and without embellishment, until his suspicion, worn down by nothing more dramatic than consistency, became something closer to attention. He began, without quite admitting it to himself, to walk that stretch of garden first each morning, before the rest of his rounds, the way a man checks first on the one thing in his charge he is least prepared to see fail. A silence. It was Mr. Sad. Pell, in fact, who first mentioned her name to the Duke, though he did so almost by accident, in a letter concerning an entirely different matter, a dispute over grazing rights on the northern boundary. whose cottage roof had been quietly reshingled the previous autumn after Eleanor mentioned the leak to a passing carpenter and paid for the materials herself out of wages she could ill afford, sent up a basket of preserves each fortnight, addressed simply to the garden girl, with no further explanation required by anyone who received it. These gestures were small, individually, and none of them announced themselves as anything more than neighborly habit. But they accumulated through the winter and into the spring in a pattern that even Mr. Pell, a man not given to sentiment, found himself unable to entirely ignore. By April, the wall stood true along its full length for the first time in a decade, and the fen beyond the eastern farms drained according to the old channels Eleanor had traced from her father's diagrams and cleared over 4 months of evening labor. The first dry spring the tenants there had known in longer than most of them could remember. It was in May that the Duke of Rendell finally came home. He arrived without ceremony on a Tuesday. Having grown tired, he told Mr. Seck, Pell with the particular wariness of a man who had spent a decade managing an estate entirely through correspondence, of reading about improvements he could not picture and expenses he could not properly account for. Gabriel Ashcombe, 6th Duke of Rendell, was 31 years old, and he had inherited the title at 19 under circumstances that had left him, by long habit, disinclined to trust reports of sudden good fortune. His father, the old Duke, died leaving an estate riddled with the quiet consequences of his own inattention, a brother's debts absorbed and never fully accounted for, a land steward dismissed under a cloud that had never properly lifted records incomplete in ways the young Duke had noticed. To investigate, he had grown into his title assuming, not unreasonably, that most reports from his own estate required a discount for optimism, and Mr. Stenier, Pell's brief mention of a housemaid who had single-handedly restored 2 ruined portions of the grounds, struck him, on first reading, as exactly that kind of report. He rode out to see the walled garden himself on his second morning at Rendell, expecting to find some modest tidying exaggerated in the retelling, and found instead a wall standing true along its entire southern face, freshly mortared, the bramble cleared to bare, turned earth beyond it, and beside the gate, coiled in a manner suggesting long habit. A lean fox, watching him with an unblinking attention, he found, despite himself, faintly unsettling. He found the woman responsible for it on her knees, at the far end of the enclosure, transplanting seedlings into a bed she had prepared the week before, and he stood at some distance for a full minute before she became aware of him, because she did not startle at footsteps the way most of his staff did not leap to her feet with the particular anxious deference he had come to expect, and, if he was honest with himself, to find tiresome. When she did rise, she rose unhurriedly, wiped her hands on her apron, and regarded him with an expression that held no fear in it whatsoever, only a kind of patient assessment, as though she were deciding not whether he would find fault with her work, but whether his opinion of it was likely to be worth the trouble of caring about. "You've done all this," he said, and it was not quite a question. "With help, Your Grace." Mr. Pell arranged the labour for the heavier stones. "But the work itself, the design of it—" "Mine," she said, without embellishment, and offered nothing further, though he waited, in the way of a man accustomed to people filling silences with justification, to see whether she would. She did not. He asked her name. She gave it, Eleanor Ashworth, and something in the sound of it caught at him without his being able to say why. A familiarity he could not immediately place, the way a half-remembered tune catches at the ear before the mind can supply its title. He did not press her further that morning. He walked the rest of the garden alone, noted the soundness of the wall with the particular satisfaction of a man who has, for the first time in a long while, found an account that matched what he could see with his own eyes, and rode back to the house turning the name Ashworth over in his mind without yet knowing what he was searching for. He found it 3 weeks later, and not because he went looking for it, but because a locked cabinet in the estate office, long assumed by everyone to contain nothing but superseded rent rolls, was opened at last during an inventory Pell had been meaning to conduct for years, and had finally, with the Duke newly resident, and taking a fresh interest in the estate's papers, undertaken in earnest. Among the superseded rolls, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept them dry and legible across more than a decade of neglect, were the confiscated ledgers of Josiah Ashworth, land steward, dismissed for conduct unbecoming in a year. The Duke had been too young to understand and too far from home, in the years since, to properly investigate. He read them alone, in the estate office, by the light of a single lamp, long after the household had gone to bed, and what he found in that precise, unhurried hand, the same hand, he realized with a slow and uncomfortable certainty, that had drawn the diagrams he had seen echoed in the drainage channels now running true beneath the eastern fen, was not the record of a dishonest man at all. It was the record of a man who had, with meticulous and damning clarity, documented his own uncle's misappropriation of estate rents across 3 years, brought that documentation directly and honestly to the Duke's own father, and been dismissed for his honesty within the month. His name quietly ruined to protect a brother. The old Duke could not bring himself to prosecute. He sat with the ledgers until the lamp burned low, reading the same pages twice, then a third time, as though repetition might yet produce a different conclusion, and found none. The handwriting in the ledgers was the same hand he had watched 3 weeks earlier, transplanting seedlings without so much as glancing up at a Duke. He did not sleep that night. He sat instead with the weight of a decision his father had made, and he himself had unknowingly inherited, the way an estate inherits its drains and its walls and its unaddressed debts, and understood, slowly, with a particular discomfort, that the woman restoring his gardens in her spare hours was not merely gifted, she was owed. And she had said nothing of it, not one word, in 2 years of service and 5 months of his own residence, because she had chosen, evidently, to let the work speak for her rather than the grievance, choice that struck him, the longer he sat with it, as a far greater dignity than he had shown at 19. Ain simply accepting his father's accounts without question. The assembly at Rendell that June had been planned before any of this came to light, a modest gathering of neighbouring gentry and tenant representatives to mark the completion of the spring drainage works, an occasion Mr. Pell had suggested as good practice for a young Duke wishing to be seen taking a personal interest in his own land. It was to be an unremarkable evening of polite congratulation, the sort of gathering at which a Duke says a few words of general satisfaction, and the assembled company applauds the good sense of whatever improvements have been made, without much inquiry into who had actually made them. It did not remain unremarkable for long, because Mrs. Fenwick, wife of a neighbouring squire, and a woman with a talent for turning any gathering into an occasion for her own performance, had heard the rumour, by then circulating freely below stairs, and inevitably above them, that the drainage work and the restored walled garden had been the doing not of any engineer brought in from London, as she had assumed, but of a housemaid. She found this so richly comic that she could not resist raising it in the hearing of the full assembled room, once the Duke's own remarks had concluded and the company had settled into the looser conversation of the evening. "I understand, your Grace," she said, with the particular brightness of a woman certain of her wit, "that we have your housemaid to thank for the state of your gardens. Perhaps she ought to be asked to explain her methods to the rest of us." "I should dearly love to hear a servant's account of hydraulic engineering." There was laughter at this, the easy, complicit laughter of a room that has been handed permission to feel superior, and several heads turned toward the doorway where Eleanor stood, having been asked by Mrs. Pex Harrow to oversee the evening's refreshments, and having no reason to expect she would become, within the space of a sentence, its subject. "Go on then, girl," someone called from further back, not unkindly so much as carelessly, the way one might call out to a performing animal. "Tell the room how you drained a fen. We're all very keen to learn." It was, everyone in the room understood, without needing to be told, a request made in mockery rather than genuine curiosity, and it carried within it an unspoken rule so ordinary that none present would have thought to name it. A servant did not address a room of her betters unless first invited to do so by someone with the standing to extend that invitation, and the Duke had not spoken, had not so much as looked toward her, and therefore the invitation, such as it was, remained a joke rather than a genuine permission, a dare disguised as a request designed to embarrass. Pause. Eleanor stood in the doorway with the tray still in her hands, and for the length of that pause, the room watched her the way a room watches anyone it expects to fail, with the particular anticipatory pleasure of an audience certain of the outcome. She did not flush, she did not set the tray down in evident agitation, nor did she retreat, as several present clearly expected, into the safety of the doorway shadow. She simply stood, weighing the moment the way she had once weighed a stretch of flooded ground, assessing not whether she was equal to the question, but whether the question, asked in that spirit, deserved an answer. It was the Duke who moved first. He rose from his chair, and the room, which had been settling into its comfortable laughter, went still at the sound of it, the particular stillness that gathers around a man of rank when he stands without explanation. He did not look at Mrs. Fenwick. He crossed the room instead, past the assembled guests who parted for him with the automatic deference of people long practiced in such parting, and came to stand not beside Eleanor but a pace before her, so that anyone wishing to address her further would first have to address him. "I confess," he said in a voice pitched to carry the length of the room without any apparent effort to do so, "that I have been wanting an account of this work myself, and have simply lacked the occasion to ask for it properly." He turned then to face the assembled company fully, and something in his bearing, unhurried, entirely without apology, settled over the room the way frost settles over standing water, silencing it by degrees. "Miss Ashworth has drained a fen that has flooded every spring for 11 years, using methods her family developed and this estate discarded. I would like the room's full attention while she explains them, not her amusement, her attention." There was no laughter in the room at all now. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and turned to her at last with a small, deliberate bow of the head that was not the bow of a duke to a servant, but something closer, in its plainness, to the bow one gives a colleague whose account one has come privately, and at considerable personal cost, to trust. "Whenever you're ready." She set the tray down on the nearest table, unhurried, and when she spoke, it was in the same plain, unadorned voice she had used with Mr. Sean Pell in the frost of that October morning, addressing the room the way she had once addressed a flooded strip of ground, as a problem with a solution rather than an occasion for performance. "The fen floods," she said, "because the channels that once drained it were dug 100 years ago and silted shut some 11 years back, when the man who maintained them was dismissed and no one thought to replace either the channels or the knowledge of how they worked. I did not invent anything new. I read my father's notebooks, and I dug out what he had already dug once before, and the water, which has never much cared who is watching it, went where it was always meant to go." She paused, and there was no defiance in the pause. The same patient assessment she had shown the Duke in the walled garden. "That is the whole of the hydraulic engineering, Mrs. Fenwick. if you'd like it in fewer words. The land remembers what it was taught. It only wanted someone willing to remember it as well. The silence that followed this was not the silence of a room caught out in cruelty, though it was certainly that too, but the silence of a room recalculating, quickly and visibly, its estimate of the woman before it, and of the man standing a pace ahead of her who had, by the simple act of rising from his chair, made plain exactly whose account was to be trusted in that room, and whose contempt was, from this evening forward, to cost something. Mr. Pell, standing near the door, with the particular satisfaction of a man watching a long, quiet suspicion finally vindicated in public, allowed himself the smallest of smiles, and said nothing at all, because nothing further needed saying. The Duke did not permit the matter to rest with a single evening's correction, because he understood by then that a public silencing of ridicule was owed to her, but that it was not, on its own, sufficient to answer 11 years of a different and far more consequential silence. 2 days after the assembly, he had Mr. Pell summon Eleanor to the estate office, not the drawing-room, a distinction he made deliberately because he wished the conversation to take place among ledgers and rent rolls rather than china and polite address, on ground that was in every sense that mattered to her, her father's rather than his own. He had the confiscated ledgers already laid open on the desk when she entered, and he watched her recognize them before he said a single word, watched the flicker of something cross her face, not shock, he thought, but a kind of long-deferred confirmation. As though she had always suspected these particular pages existed somewhere, and had simply never expected to see them produced by a duke's own hand. "I found these in a locked cabinet 3 weeks ago," he said. "I have read them in full, more than once. I would like to tell you what I believe they show, and I would like you to correct me where I am wrong, because I suspect you know this history rather better than I do." She said nothing yet, and he did not mistake her silence for permission withheld. He understood by now that this was simply how she listened. "They show that your father discovered my uncle diverting rents from 2 of the estate's most productive farms across some 3 years, he said. That he brought this directly to my father, in writing, with full documentation, exactly as a steward is meant to do. And that my father, rather than prosecute his own brother, dismissed your father instead, under a charge invented for the purpose, and confiscated these records so that no one after him could easily discover what had actually occurred." He paused. "I do not offer this as a discovery I am proud of. I offer it because I believe you are owed the plain statement of it from someone with the standing to make that statement mean something." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, it was without heat, in the same tone she might have used to describe the depth of a drainage channel. "My father spent the rest of his life trying to have that record corrected. He wrote to your father twice a year for 9 years, received no reply. He considered a genuine answer. He died, believing the correction would never come, and he taught me everything he knew about this land in the evenings while he waited for a letter that was never going to arrive." She looked at the ledgers on the desk, not at the Duke. "I did not come back to Rendell to obtain this conversation, Your Grace. I came back because the fen was still flooding, and I had the means to stop it. Whatever else follows from this desk today, that much was never conditional on it." "I understand that," he said. "I believe it is precisely why it should follow anyway." What followed over the course of that summer was neither swift nor especially dramatic, because the Duke had come, by temperament and by the plain evidence of the woman before him, to distrust anything that resolved itself too quickly to be trusted. He had the ledgers formally authenticated by the family's own solicitor, had Josiah Ashworth's dismissal struck from the estate's official record and replaced with a written acknowledgment of the truth of the matter, entered into the same permanent rolls that had once carried the false account, so that anyone consulting Rendell's History in 100 Years would find the correction sitting exactly where the injury had once stood. He offered Eleanor formally the restored position her father had held, land steward, in full, with the standing and the wage the title carried, and the authority to manage not merely the walled garden and the eastern fen, but the whole of Rendell's neglected acreage, according to whatever methods she judged the land required. She accepted the position, though not, she made plain to him, in that same unhurried voice, out of any need for vindication, since vindication, she said, was a fine enough thing to receive, but a poor enough thing to have needed in the first place. She accepted it because the work itself was the thing she had always wanted, and because it seemed to her, on reflection, that a title correctly given was simply a tool like any other, and she had never been a woman inclined to refuse a good tool once it was properly in her hand. The paperwork that formalized all of this, the correction to the estate rolls, the restoration of her father's name, the deed of appointment naming her steward in his place, was signed, not in the great hall before an audience, but in the same estate office, where the ledgers had first been laid open, Hell and the family solicitor, because both Eleanor and the Duke had come to agree, without ever quite discussing it aloud, that the truest form of justice available to either of them was not a public spectacle, but a quiet, permanent correction to the record. What became of the courtship that followed is a matter the estate's own servants disagreed about for years afterward, some insisting it began that very evening in the estate office, others swearing it was not until the following spring, when the Duke was observed walking the length of the restored walled garden, at an hour no Duke had any obvious reason to be walking it, that anything between them could properly be called an understanding. Eleanor herself, asked much later by a niece who wanted the story for its romance rather than its accounting, would only say that patience, properly practiced, tends to arrive at its own conclusions in its own time, and that she had long ago stopped measuring the value of anything by how quickly it announced itself. The fox continued to appear at the walled garden through that autumn and the winter following, sitting at its accustomed distance while she worked, watching with the same unhurried attention it had shown from the first frosted morning she had cleared bramble there alone, and it was still coming, the household would later say. On the morning the following June, when smoke rose thin and steady from the restored chimneys of the old steward's cottage, reopened and resettled, the fire lit there for the first time in 11 years by a woman who had, finally, after all that patient labor, come home to the exact ground her father had once taught her to read like scripture. The land remembers what it was taught, she had said, in a room that had once mocked her and would never again think to. It only wanted someone willing to remember it as well.